This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Liam. It's really hot in the background. So
Catherine will give a little info. Did she ask you to get this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That looks like it.
Am I just yelling? I don't need a microphone to do it. Or do you guys use one? Or is there one? I won't walk around. What do you do? You just talk?
Well, what I care about is being recorded, and we are recorded either way.
Okay. I was just saying, you don't need a microphone. No. But as long as I'm being adequately recorded.
Yeah, should we log in? Should we log in?
Yep, so I've got...
Oh, perfect. Okay. So that's what you stay up here so I can do that. You want me to log in and view?
I don't mind doing that. I'm just trying to get this thing to work.
I can do it till whatever, so 10.
Yeah, yeah.
I think 10 is our ideal, Rebecca.
Yep. I've only got, I kept slides minimum for me, so
Yep.
it's just kind of going through those points.
Great. That's right. Excellent. Okay.
Do you need a hand?
No. No. Oh, well, capital.
Do you use this?
Won't it get recorded here? Or it needs to get
Yeah, but that's also amplified, so...
Oh, okay. If I have to stand here, it gets recorded later. Yeah. Sorry.
Neither do I really. Loading PowerPoint. Would it be better to do that now or just when we come up?
Yeah, why
When
not?
it come up, yeah, whatever.
And when I say why not, I guess the only reason why not is because the computer still hasn't started itself yet. But... Do you want to start talking?
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Okay, today we've got a really fantastic session planned for you. So the title of the first half of the lecture is around development and use and development of theory. So what we have today is for brilliant scholars who are all based here at the University of Melbourne doing their PhD studies, except for Alana, you're based out of the University of British Columbia. So these four students are going to talk about the application or applying theory to practice. So we're going to have a bit of an insight, and each of the scholars are going to talk for around 10 minutes on within their research project of how they have applied theory to practice. So what I'm hoping after today is you have a really good understanding and idea of how an application of theory actually helps you to solve problems as well, rather than moving away from the use of theory, actually really wanting to engage with theory within practice. So first of all, we've got Rebecca, and Rebecca's got a fantastic title. So we've got Rebecca Clements. Her title is "Turns Out Theory Will Stop You from Going Insane." So I think it's brilliant.
I don't know how much I actually made the presentation to that title, but I just came up with it late last night.
But it just shows you how important theory is, but actually how it really helps you in the problem solving around different issues on urbanisation. So Rebecca is an urban planning PhD candidate here at University of Melbourne, and Rebecca is looking at car parking policy in Japanese cities. Her work broadly focuses on transport justice and accessibility, as well as urban governance and social equity, and are particularly interested in the conflicts between the urban transition and car dominance. Excellent. Except for, got it? Yep. Great. So
I can just use this here. Thank you very much.
Spacebar or you hit the arrow.
Okay. Okay, hi. Oh, I don't know how long this is going to take, so I'll just see how I go and try and keep track of my... Yes, it will take 10 minutes. I don't know how long it'll take in an ideal sort of way. So I came up with that title because I think that broadly captures my feelings about what theory gave to me coming into urban planning. And as a context for me, urban planning was a kind of a career change. So I only came into planning 5 years ago or something like that. And before that, I was an illustrator, cartoonist, and an English teacher. So it was a complete change in thinking, and especially to come back to university and to come back to academia, which I had never thought I was going to do. So in a really, really short and sweet way, my experience in coming to planning and coming to academia and going on this journey, I'm going to use that word even though it's horrible, is coming to appreciate theory, I suppose, in all kinds of iterations and slowly over time as I went. So just really quickly, I'm going to touch on my personal experience, how it relates to my research and then talk a little bit about how I see the relationship between practice and theory, and then sort of a little bit more specifically how I think it is helpful broadly. So, as I said, this is my journey, and I thought Wizard of Oz was a good picture for this. So I sort of started out, I guess, like really idealistic about what the existing knowledge base for city planning was. I really thought, like, well, you know, we've got a pretty good idea of how cities work, and we're really just sort of tweaking things, and I want to come in and help, you know, tweak all of those little gaps in the knowledge base. And of course that was eventually shattered. That wasn't actually what the reality was as I went through my Masters of Urban Planning. So then I kind of, I suppose, went into the cynicism about what the hell we're all doing here when my idea was shattered. And then I suppose, like, very broadly after that, though of course it's a back and a forth, I came to really appreciate what theory had to offer me, which was as a number of things, such as a companion that I would take along my journey, helping me like a guide, a walking stick, a signpost for directions I could go in. It was also very foundational, like it really became kind of the ground that I walked on as an academic, as a researcher. And also the blue sky, like the thing that I'm aiming for. So it's kind of all of these things. Oops. So the point I probably wanted to make about my research is that for me, I came to realize that theory was really inseparable from history. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in a class which is called Theory and History, but really that's kind of how I came to think about it. I had come in thinking I was going to be a really practical planner, and I was going to go straight into practice, and I was going to be really just practical, whoa, practical. And that, as I said, that was really shattered when I realized that kind of way of thinking didn't hold enough for me. And so theory became really important, but I realized, like, I really had to go back through history and through the historical thought about ideas, about planning, about society, about humanity, etc. That was where I really needed to go to understand what I'm even doing as a planner or as a researcher, or what any of us are doing. So to me, these two things are absolutely inseparable. Contemporary and also the common understandings that are sort of going around in the planning world were just inadequate. They just weren't satisfying to me. So what I mean by history as well is not just events, but, as I said, the history of ideas and the history of thinking. And of course, as many of you will probably know, when you go into a PhD, this is the sort of thing that you will inevitably deal with. You'll go back through a lot of history of philosophy, philosophical thinking, sociological thinking, etc. But it turns out it's really, really important and really useful. So the other point to make about this, and the other thing that was a really big realization for me in a lot of the various sort of directions my thinking was going, is that I think it's really important to understand that everything is contextual, absolutely everything, all of our perspectives, all of our practices, all of our ideas. And so it's really important to look at history to give us insights into what that context was. And that informs also the context of the ideas that have built upon the ideas that have built upon the ideas, and the ideas that we can jump back to, etc. So that's just a really important point to underline there. And the other thing that's really important to my research is that I felt personally very lost in my research until I really came to investigate the thought around ethics, and that has become very foundational and continues to be very foundational to my perspective and to my research. So again, I think theory itself is very inseparable from ethics. So just as one example of how I've directly been using theories in my research, like my research is now very strongly oriented around transport justice and very informed by a theory called the capabilities approach. So these are all sort of tied up with other ideas that are really important to me on what is a good and what is a just city. Various theories of justice, and there's a very sort of there's a set of theories around that. What is the right to the city, which is a very complex idea, and the commons and the public realm, which is something that I didn't come into planning thinking was important and it really has become very, very important to me now. So all of these things became basically key guiding mechanisms for me when I found all of the other ideas around me just inadequate. They just ultimately didn't answer my questions that I had about life in that really broad sense. So obviously these things are drawn from a lot of disciplines, and Catherine touched upon this last week. So a lot of them are from sociology, economics, geography. They come from all over. And one of the ways in which it's been sort of useful for me to think about them sometimes is that, you know, these ideas and these ways of thinking are kind of built over time from like what you might call a provenance or like a relay race of theorists, and that's really oversimplifying things. But again, I think it touches on that conception that you can have of a very, very long history of society and humanity and ideas that are shaping things as you go by. And that really is important to actually to understand when you're going into these things. So for example, the capabilities approach is really associated with two key thinkers, Sen and Nussbaum, and they're drawing on a number of justice theorists such as Rawls, but they've built upon those ideas in their own particular way. And transport justice, somebody that I'm very interested in at the moment is a guy called Martens, and he specifically conceives, creates a concept of transport justice, which is a very, and I've highlighted this bit because I think this is an important point, it's a very carefully constructed idea of transport justice that builds his foundation of what justice is and how we can apply it. So it's using all of these theories, and he's sort of really taking them apart, saying what he thinks is useful, saying what he thinks doesn't really apply to justice, or what is an inadequate conception of justice and fairness. And that careful construction is the strength of his argument. It's what makes his argument a very, very, for me, from my perspective, a very strong argument in the end. So it's that very solid theoretical foundation that I think makes his argument something that I am happy to start applying to practice. And the other point that I want to make here is that practice taught me the importance of priority. Priority is a thing that often comes up in decision making, but theory is the thing that gave me guidance on how to prioritize. What is just prioritization? So I think some common misconceptions about theory is that it's unapplied, it's abstract and complex, simplistic, it's irrelevant to reality, it's separate to practice. And I don't think any of these things are true, or they might be true in tiny little pieces. But I think that it's also important, and I won't go through all of this, but it's important to unpick what you even think practice is and what you even think theory is. Like in reality, there's a much more blurred line between these two. There's a much more complex, circular, reflexive relationship. And so it's important to pull away from thinking about these things as a binary concept. And ultimately, you know, theory, ultimately to some degree, arises from practice. And as I said, it's a non-linear sort of relationship. It's a non-linear, oops, what did I do there? Yeah. So some of the common limitations to practice are that you've often got very limited resources, very limited time for thinking. Conflicts arise, and you need to think about how to actually navigate those conflicts. And another point that I just want to really quickly make here is that in my personal experience, friends and colleagues that I have working in practice are often inevitably tested and challenged by their work, and sometimes they are spiritually crushed. And I think that is when you will be glad that you have some understanding of theory, and theory can be a thing that you can turn to for guidance, to open up problems, to overcome blockages that you're having, to reorient yourself, to legitimize your action, just to connect ideas that you wouldn't ordinarily have connected, and just to get a new perspective on things. I think just for sanity's sake, it's something that you will find very helpful, and I definitely did. And the other last point I want to really quickly make, conscious that I've gone over time, is that when you're thinking about the future, and you'll go over this in a lot of your other subjects, the future is just fundamentally uncertain. So I think that there's no way that we can deal with future thinking, which is what we do in planning, without looking back at the patterns and the ideas and the history of these ideas and where they've brought us, because we're going to be inevitably, we're going to be dealing with existing characterizations and patterns, and we want to be able to look at them critically and bounce off of them and sometimes use them or sometimes bounce away from them. But that does require looking at that history of ideas fundamentally, I think. So I'll leave it there. I've gone to 12 minutes, I'm sorry. But yes, thank you.
Questions at the end. Okay, our next speaker. I'll introduce you while you grab. Okay, so our next speaker is Alana Nolan. So Alana is actually a PhD candidate in human geography at the University of British Columbia, of course in Vancouver. So Alana's research explores the local impacts of national security and counter-terrorism on multicultural community developments and urban planning within Greater Melbourne. So, of course, a very hot, unfortunately hot topical topic, and quite new to planning as well. So her interest is how global, national and local scales interact and shape one another, was cultivated at the University of Melbourne. In the urban planning program, so the program that you're doing at the moment. So since Alana completing in 2011, Alana has worked as a planner, a researcher, and policy consultant in non-profit, government and private sectors in both Canada and Australia. And in the past decade, Alana has also worked in community development, education and research within all different organisations, the Red Cross, Check Your Head, and also City of Vancouver. So welcome, thank you.
Catherine. Can you hear me? Is that working? Yeah? Okay. So I guess I've been interested in the social lives of cities for a while now, and given that I was sort of asked to talk about this with some others, I was looking back over some past projects and trying to figure out how, like in hindsight, how theory had kind of shaped some of the research and the work that I've done. And I never considered myself to be a person who was particularly, comfortable with theory, maybe. When I started my PhD program, everyone went around the room and introduced themselves by saying things like, "Hi, my name is Adam and I'm a Foucauldian," or "Hi, my name is Andrew and I'm a Marxist." And I thought, oh my God, this is terrifying. And I said, "Hi, my name's Alana and I'm an urban planner." I thought I had no idea how to be in this space. But now looking back, I realized the one kind of quote that I keep coming back to actually is this one by Leonie Sandercock. And she says, "Contemporary cities are sites of struggle over space, which are really two kinds of struggle. One's a struggle over life space against economic space, and the other is a struggle over belonging." I guess in this, one of the points that she's making is that spatial relations and social relations are co-constituted. People's experiences of places shape their social relationships, and social relationships shape the places that we exist in. She also asks, how can we manage our coexistence in the shared spaces of the multicultural cities of the 21st century? So thinking about settler immigrant societies, and in particular the ones that I've lived in, at least Melbourne and Vancouver being the main ones, this is a question that I've been interested in. And she sort of asks, how can people be at home in these cities, and what role does urban planning play? So I guess her work is a theoretical project, but it also has applications for city planning. Today I want to speak really briefly. I'll try, I don't know if I'll make it across all three, but at least two projects that I've worked on in the past few years. And tell you about the research problem, how theory was used, and how theory was applied, I guess, in thinking about practice. So the first is my Masters of Urban Planning minor thesis, which David was my supervisor, and I looked at young people's experiences of downtown Melbourne and social inclusion and exclusion. The second was a project I worked on as an independent consultant with the City of Richmond in Vancouver, which was looking at social cohesion and visual landscapes in that City of Richmond. And the third is my PhD thesis, which is titled Countering Violent Extremism in a Multicultural City, a Study of National Security at the Local Scale. So first, the minor thesis. So the problem that I was thinking about was, well, I guess between 2009 and 2010, roughly, young people in Melbourne were in the news a lot. There was moral panic. Young people were seen to be misbehaving, were being characterised as antisocial in their behaviour in like downtown Melbourne. Young people were depicted in the media as a threat to the order and the security of the city, and were being over-policed and excluded, particularly in public spaces, and also on and around public transit. The Lord Mayor, Robert Doyle, at the time came out and said that young people shouldn't be coming into the city, that they should, I think he said, bogan it up at home, and that the city should be reserved for, like, say, people coming in to see the opera. Young people were speaking back in the media, though, and explaining that they were being misrepresented, that there were fewer and fewer places for them to hang out, and that was in part because of the privatisation of a lot of public space, and also the surveillance, and they were effectively being pushed out. So some of the questions that I was asking were around, should young people have a place in downtown Melbourne, and why? What factors impact on their experiences of the city? And if there should be youth-oriented spaces or youth-inclusive spaces, what should they look like? And so to answer these questions, I undertook focus groups and interviews and things like that. I did some spatial analysis, and then I also found that I really needed theory to basically help me unpack what I was finding. So some of the theory that I drew on was urban theory from people like Robert Park from the Chicago School, an urban sociologist, Richard Sennett, George Simmel, people like that, who each made a case for why and how the city was important for a site of community development, for identity development, experimentation, for seeing and being seen, and also for being invisible. Theory around moral panic and youth geographies helped me to unpack the negative discourse in the media and revealed the ways in which the city was being conceived as adult-centric. And similarly, this was the case in many of the City of Melbourne's policies and their zoning. I drew on the right to the city theories from folks like Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, Ruth Fincher and Kurt Iveson, who made a case for being in the city as politically, socially and culturally important to shaping and reshaping the city in a way that represented a fuller spectrum of the public. And among other theoretical works, I picked up on ideas around urban citizenship, recognition, representation, geographies of encounter, urban diversities, all of those kinds of things that were basically used to develop an argument for the positive potential of inclusive urban spaces. And then finally, I referred to UNICEF's Child-Friendly Cities framework that set out both theoretical and practical ways in which young people could be included, represented and provided with opportunities to develop a sense of belonging in downtown Melbourne. So applying all of this, some of the recommendations that I was able to effectively justify using theory and in combination with the data that I'd collected were around making changes to the zoning in the city for youth-oriented spaces, which were generally located on the margins of the city. So I was, made a case for them to be centred, to expand the vision of the city and city policies to one that was all ages inclusive rather than adult-centric, to actively reach out to young people to participate in urban planning decision-making processes to develop their sense of participation and belonging. And there are a few other things, including education programs and counter-narratives, but I feel like I should move on. So the second project was a project I undertook at the City of Richmond. Like I said, the planning department had me in to basically help them understand this problem that they were seeing, or that they were dealing with, I guess. So between around 2013 and 15, there was a really active and loud campaign by a small group of residents around what they saw as an overwhelming presence of non-English signages, non-English language on urban signage. This angry group had been complaining about a sense of disbelonging and displacement that they kind of saw as being represented in the visual landscape of the city, and they felt like it didn't sufficiently represent them, and they demanded new planning regulations to be introduced to enforce English as a primary language on all signage. The city had been kind of pushing them away for a couple of years, and eventually they, because of an election cycle, they had to demonstrate that they were responding in some way. So the questions that the planners, the City of Richmond, were asking was, should they introduce regulation around language on urban signage? And how best could they foster social harmony in the urban landscape? So in this case, theory provided a clear evaluation framework. The three main theories that were drawn on were theories around linguistic landscapes, which actually also provided a methodological approach as well as an analytical framework, which is kind of important. Maybe that theory oftentimes informs research methods too. I guess using this kind of linguistic landscapes theory, I was able to kind of uncover some of the underlying issues that were going on. So it was discovered that it wasn't really an issue, it was more just the reality that the signage existed in part because Richmond was made up of 60% immigrant population, and many immigrants coming to Canada needed to arrive in Canada with were arriving in Canada on a business pathway, which meant that they had to start a business, which meant that inevitably they would have signage for their business that was in the language that they were most familiar with. So that was just a reality, and that was also related to national policy. Also, in doing a count, it was discovered that only 3%, so hardly any of the signage in the city actually had no English. So what was people were reacting to was quite different from what was actually going on in the street. So then the other theory that I kind of drew on was the theory of superdiversity, which a German guy called Steven Verdebeck has developed. And that helped to unpack the idea presented by this angry group that Richmond had become a polarised place. And it was actually a far more diverse community than was being represented and being acknowledged. In other words, the signage didn't tell the full story of the city, and nor should it be feared or interpreted as such. So theories around multiculturalism also helped to trouble this idea of social harmony, which was being used by planners and councillors at the time in the city. Much of the theoretical work around multiculturalism argues that real multiculturalism or urban diversity is messy, grumpy, conflictual, and impolite, but that it can be all of those things and still functional. And that has implications for planning process. So the recommendations that ended up coming out of this that were developed in consultation with the planners were that what was needed really wasn't regulation of signage. It was really like planning controls wouldn't solve this problem of these angry residents. What they needed really was to actually sit down and have FaceTime with one another, and that could be done through an urban planning process, which is something that Leonie Sandicott really advocates for. So in addition to going against the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which that would be the case if they had regulated, it would have also inflamed tensions. It would have legitimated the concerns that these angry residents had, which really didn't deserve legitimising, and it would have given them more ammunition. I'm going to skip the last piece and just talk quickly, just to wrap up. So I guess the way that I've used theory has been more of a patchwork or as a toolkit. No one theory really is able to provide a full explanation. I tend to use multiple theoretical tools in my research and work. And I guess doing a PhD, as these guys know, is really difficult. And sometimes you have so much data and so much information that you're trying to sort through that it's like you're drowning in information. And it's at those times, I think Rebecca kind of touched on this, theory comes in really handy because you can step back and you can apply this oftentimes like too simple framework because it doesn't quite fit your case study. But you can use it to make sense of what you're seeing. And then when it doesn't make sense, those gaps, those nonsense moments actually become sites for new learning and new theory and adaptation. And I guess the same goes for many planning jobs in which you'll oftentimes be dealing with big sets of data and trying to make sense of them and overwhelmed, and that's when theory becomes like, I guess, your crutch. Anyway, that's it. Thanks. I went over.
Oh, what
Okay, so our third speaker is James Whitten. So James is also a PhD candidate here at the University of Melbourne. James comes from quite an extensive practice background. So James is also a registered architect, urban designer and urban researcher with over 15 years of professional practice. So James did his Bachelor of Planning and Design and Bachelor of Architecture here at the University of Melbourne, but then did his Masters of Architecture in Urban Design at Harvard University. So James's PhD, as I said, is already here. James started in 2016. So his research draws on spatial governance literature from both Europe and the UK to understand how high-speed rail might transform planning and governance in regional Australia. So a very topical topic. Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. Presentation. All right. Sorry about this, guys. Just worried to myself. Get rid of that, and we'll just go with that. All right, cool. Thanks, Catherine and David. And I'll apologise in advance. My theory is still being grounded, so I'm just going to read from my notes and try and stick to the schedule as best as I can. So I'm about 2 years into my PhD, and I'm going to talk about theory and how it has helped me to understand my research problem as opposed to answer any of my research questions today. For me, the problem of HSR development in Australia is both an abstract and a problem and a very practical one as well. As per the title of my project, I'm anticipating that HSR, by virtue of its sheer scale, cost and complexity, will have a transformative effect on urbanisation in Australia. Specifically, I'm using a single case study of HSR planning in the Hume region, which is in the northeast of this state of Victoria, to understand how it might influence wider planning and governance processes. There we go. So I've enlisted 3 theories, or rather conceptual frameworks, in my research, and they're spatial governance, hybridities and frenetic planning. And I'm going to explain those a bit more, but the first one, spatial governance, broadly comes from the UK, and one of the leaders of that is Patsy Healy. The other one, hybridities, is also from the UK, Mike Racco, and then Bent Fluevberg, who's like the global mega projects expert from Denmark. So I'm drawing on those 3 theories primarily, and they're probably necessary because together they help me to better connect practices of planning and governance to their spatial and political context, which when you're studying large-scale infrastructure is a really important thing to do. I also thought it would be best to present all 3 today in case you wanted to use one or all of them in your own research. So, what is the research problem that I'm interested in? First, to move to the more abstract of the 2 problems. In 2013, I undertook an urban design thesis as part of my master's degree, exploring scenarios for regional development after the introduction of high-speed rail. For that to work, I focused on the development prospects of several regional cities along the proposed HSR route, and I used a series of speculative design proposals because I was in an urban design course. I also used allegory, which is a kind of story or narrative within meaning, to tease out the tensions inherent to HSR development in Australia. So this is in the equivalent of the minor thesis. In brief, the allegory spoke to the deep dynamics that inform large-scale processes of urban development in Australia, and what I called at that time these sort of competing models of urbanisation that I really became interested in. And I argued that these dynamics would influence outcomes from HSR development to the detriment of regional communities. And I'm from a regional community, and you'll probably find that most researchers have their research interests close to their heart. This illustration speaks to those tensions which play out across different urban geographies, planning scales and social sectors. I've jumped the gun. So, as part of the literature review for my PhD, I was able to name these dynamics. So, coming into the PhD program, it gave me an opportunity to do that. And there's these dynamics of centralisation of political economic power in Australia, partisan approaches to regional development. There's corporatisation of urban infrastructure planning, which is happening quite strongly right now, and a strong metropolitan regional policy divide. So that was from the first part, or the first problem. The second and more practical problem relates to the challenge of integrating HSR spatially and institutionally into the Hume region. So we're moving from the abstract to the more concrete. The issue here is that if HSR is not spatially integrated with existing urban and infrastructure systems, it's going to polarise spatial development. The map on the left describes the most recently proposed route for HSR, and you can see where the Hume region is situated to the northeast of Melbourne. The analysis in the top right suggests that polarisation will be quite strong in Hume, concentrating population and economic development around the HSR stations in Shepparton and Wodonga. Now, growth in regional areas is a good thing, of course, but the challenge here is to extend the benefits of increased accessibility to sub-regions surrounding the HSR stations so that development is spatially balanced. Importantly, balanced spatial development is a policy objective of the Victorian State Government and of Hume's own Regional Sustainable Community Strategy, and is arguably also a prerequisite of sustainable development more broadly. So in a nutshell, and sort of zooming back out to the more abstract problem of urban dynamics, my PhD research is investigating the planning and governance practices and power relations that underlie this disconnect between what we want high-speed rail planning to do in an ideal sense and what's actually happening when we come around to planning it. And so I'm going to step you through now the different theories that I use to try and understand how that's working. And now I can change the slide. There we go. So the first one is spatial governance. And in my case, and it's probably the case for many research projects, the theory or set of frameworks that I selected for my project were developed in a context that has, to some extent, addressed some of these problems successfully, and for high-speed rail development, that context is Europe. Spatial governance is the principal framework for my project, and it encompasses a range of perspectives on urban governance. These perspectives, and I wrote this before the lecture, I'm not exactly sure which year level you guys are in, but if you do urban governance, you'll come to know a lot more of these perspectives much better, if not so already. And they're useful in my research. This is hierarchical governance and network governance up here, because they allow me to name the practices used by planners of HSR. Most importantly, under the rubric of spatial governance, or the overall framework of spatial governance, they enable me to understand how governance is being used to integrate high-speed rail into Hume. So, did I flick? No. So specifically, how governance agents are used to coordinate or join up policy and plan-making activities, how they're used to produce strategic plans and framing visions, and how the extent of regions are reconfigured to sort of engender certain development outcomes. So spatial governance allows me to look at all these things. And is particularly useful in these respects because it was explicitly developed to understand the relationship between the practices of urban planning and governance and the processes of regional integration or political devolution. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but regional integration is more or less the process by which power is devolved and shared between government levels and social sectors, and to do that, higher levels of integration are required between urban geographies and territorial levels and things like that. But in using spatial governance in my research, I found a few limitations, not in the framework itself, but in its application to my particular research topic. Spatial governance has helped me to understand why the most recent HSR proposal was not well integrated into its spatial and institutional context. First, planning was heavily centralised and governed by the upper echelons of government, so it was a very top-down planning process. Secondly, there was a curiously close relationship between the government and a small number of very powerful corporate actors who do not, at present, have development interests in regional areas. However, the limits of the application theory emerge when the solutions that spatial governance suggests are incongruent with understandings of how multi-level governance actually works in Australia. So there's this disconnect between what should be happening and what's actually happening, and that is, and this is stated over simply, you know, if we just better coordinated governance activities and planning across all the scales and social sectors, then a different, more regionally integrated outcome would eventuate. But this overlooks the day-to-day of federal-state relations in Australia, of the way that multi-level governance works in Australia and the many challenges that it has. It also underlooks the overarching sort of structural factors that shape particularly large infrastructure projects, because there's a lot of sort of globally sort of sourced capital and finance that flows into them. So in short, it overlooks context, and this has been picked up on the previous discussions as well. So then I sort of looked at bringing in and just making sure how I'm going for time. A minute or two. Okay, we won't get as far then. So I looked to another framework which more specifically integrated context into high-speed, my understanding of high-speed rail development. And in this framework, hybridities, Bracco uses a relatively new perspective on governance called meta-governance. Meta-governance describes the way that governments and other powerful groups use narratives, social norms, regulations and the like to choreograph actors in planning processes who think that they're self-governed. And so it also has been called the governance of governance, which sounds a bit abstract, but that makes a lot of sense when you think about the way that our daily lives tend to be regulated in a very hands-off way as opposed to a hands-on way. So in short, Bracco used a hybridity of conceptual approaches to analyse large planning projects, and he combined these three perspectives on governments to do so. But I'm going to speak to some of the issues that came out of that for me in relation to research into large-scale infrastructure, and again it comes back to context. And particularly when you're studying large-scale infrastructure, being able to integrate aspects of power and power relations into the research, which are more normative or sort of ideally oriented frameworks don't necessarily pick up on, because when planning fails, those frameworks can sort of say, all right, well, it's failed and these are the reasons why, but they can't give you an overall context for why planning has failed. And so in my study of large-scale infrastructure, I've had to look towards other frameworks, such as the frenetic planning approach by Bent Fluevberg, which more explicitly draws out the power relations that act upon governance of large-scale infrastructure networks. And here you're getting more down into the fine-grained detail of who gains and who loses and by which mechanisms of power from large-scale infrastructure. And so what, in combining these three levels of theory, these three theories has enabled me to do is to move across what I call different levels of practice. And so you have the area where you look at theories that can tell you what practices, how practices are linked to outcomes, which is more of the spatial governance practical framework. And then you drop down into another framework which says, well, what actually are the rationalities that are guiding those practices? You know, why are people talking about a particular program or project of a debate in that way? That enables you to bring a bit more of the discursive or narrative context up into the project that you're studying. And then, importantly for large infrastructure, to really dive down into the political and social context, because large infrastructure, and from my research this is very important, is essentially a distributive element. So it redistributes resources from one part of a territory to another. And so it's intrinsically political by nature, and to overlook power relations and politics when you're studying large infrastructure is highly problematic. So I will leave it more or less at that. This final slide, which I can leave with you, is a roadmap, hopefully not too confusing journey today. I call it a social scientific perspective on large infrastructure planning. Coming from a planning and design background, I've had to do this. But it could also be described as an architect's attempt to grapple with academic planning. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for your time.
And on to our fourth and final speaker. So our fourth speaker is Eric. Eric's topic is around applying resilience theories to flood management in informal settlements. Now, Eric has trained as an urban planner and urban planning and development economics in Ghana, Germany and Italy. He has had a brief professional stint in community planning, offering consultancy services to local government agency as a member of a team that detailed sector layout for several townships in Ghana. Eric has also worked in a variety of different international institutions as well, through a cultural organisation, the International Institute for Environment and Development, and the European Union. So Eric is in his first year of his PhD studies here at the University of Melbourne. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I am currently in my first year of my PhD research at the Melbourne School of Design and trying to look at social capital and flood resilience in informal settlements. And I was basically motivated to take this research area because I had done some studies during my master's in Ghana in informal settlements about how people in informal settlements provide and manage infrastructure in those settlements. And then back in Germany, I did a course in urban resilience, and I realized that in most of the discourse on urban resilience, we realize there's the kind of disconnect of urban informality out of resilience topics. So that actually was my main motivation for doing this research. So today I'm basically going to talk about how I'm going to apply resilience theories with, as well as social capital for my research here. And basically in this presentation I talk about what resilience is, how it has been applied in urban planning and management, as well as how I am applying it in my research. So in my reading I realized that resilience has become a very trending topic lately. Some authors are indicating that it is becoming more like a buzzword that is replacing sustainability since the 1980s. Others also believe, and as a result of that, it is actually losing meaning because every discipline seems to be adopting it, but explaining it in very different ways. But others also think that it is really good because having other disciplines, tapping into a concept like resilience helps in sustainable development agenda. But with my readings, I realized that resilience could be summarized in three main areas. Looking at engineering resilience, that is where the systems and infrastructure in urban settlements are designed such that they have the resistance to change, and as well as being able to bounce back as a result of failure. And then in terms of, other new scholars seems to focus on the fact that we cannot have a specific point of functioning of a system such that we say we want a system after failure to be returning to that. And for that matter, the focus should be a system not necessarily returning to the unoriginal state that was before, but rather be focusing on being able to function and provide the services that it was supposed to have provided. And in urban planning, we seem to have been adopted what we call the social ecological resilience that tries to link societies with nature, as well as also looking at the dynamism that we exhibit in urban systems or human systems. And in terms of applications, resilience in the literature has been applied to strategic planning, that is using the ideas of functionality after failure to framing urban planning problems, as well as analyzing and formulating policy options. And this helps us to understand the dynamics of urban systems and how resilience thinking can be applied to transformation and adaptive planning. As well as resilience has also been applied for governance and management, seeing how we can use like natural resource management as well as social systems and coming together for urban planning issues. And it has also been used in infrastructure planning as well as disaster planning. And disaster resilience actually is what my research focuses on. Now, in terms of disaster resilience, realize that with the problems of climate change, we expect a lot of problems that is to come with natural hazards and the rest. And most of the studies dwelt on looking at how, when this disaster occurs, especially as it's happening in the Asia-Pacific regions, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, how the systems are able to bounce back on its feet. And as a result of that, the focus was basically looking at the physical components of cities. For instance, one author indicated that physical infrastructure actually is the bones, the body, the arteries, as well as the muscles of urban areas. And so the attention on disaster resilience was basically to look at how the physical systems or physical infrastructures could be strengthened. And this, as a result, led to living out the social dimensions as we have in most cities. And when the social issues were being brought up, it was basically to focus on how emergency organizations are able to respond to disasters as and when they occur. But now there has been a shift, which is rather indicating that instead of focusing on how to bounce back from disaster, because when disasters happen, there's really going to be a loss of so many things in terms of lives lost, in terms of infrastructure that is being destroyed. And the idea of bouncing back actually is not practical. And for that matter, we should be looking at how to really move on after disaster. And that basically focuses on improving the capabilities of people and how they are able to respond and deal with disasters when they occur. So for my research, basically it's motivated by the challenges that we foresee to be facing urban managers in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of the problems of urbanization and climate disasters that are happening. And I am focusing on Ghana, which is my home country, and focusing on the city of Accra, the capital of Ghana, which is one of the largest coastal cities that we can find in Africa. And since 1995, we've had the recurrence of flooding in Accra, which has led to the loss of over 500 lives and more than 450,000 people displaced. If you look at a city that has a population of just about 2 million, and we have almost 450,000 people being displaced, then you realize what the problem is. And in terms of damages in infrastructure and properties, we also have had such incidences. And this has been recurring over the years. But then the problem is that these areas, informal settlements have been the main culprits of the problems of flooding in these informal settlements, in Accra. But we also project that as the city is growing, where we are going to have, especially in Ghana, we are going to have about 2/3 of residents in Ghana living in urban areas. And out of this, almost 2/3 of these people living in these urban areas are also going to live in informal settlements. Then the problems of flooding in informal settlements should be at the forefront of policy discussions and the rest. But in terms of reviewing the literature, I realized that the focus on flood management has rather been on how to control flooding in terms of building sea defense walls as well as other physical infrastructures, which has really not helped. And for that matter, some are rather saying that why not shift at looking at resilience, which seeks to improve people's capacity to be able to, if not respond to the flooding, rather cope and adapt to the problems that comes with flooding. But the focus in terms of government policy in Ghana has still been on the physical aspect, whereas the research is also showing that social components like social capital, as in the networks of people, as well as the kind of relationship that people have with each other, is able to really lessen the impact that comes with flooding. And so that is basically what my research seeks to look at. So I asked the question, does social capital, and we've seen in its application being applied mostly in advanced countries, where other scholars are also saying that social capital as pertains in less developed countries, as well as informal settlements, are rather detrimental to the growth of those areas. So I tried to look at whether social capital and social networks affect flood resilience in informal settlements. So basically my questions are to look at how social capital influences flood resilience in informal settlements, and how the recurrence of flooding has also influenced social capital in informal settlements and what really are the determinants of social capital in informal settlements. So theoretically, I'm looking at applying the theories of resilience, looking at how it has changed from mere resistance to the people's capacity to cope and adapt to flooding, and also linking it to theories on social capital, which looks at people's association with other people in terms of formal organizations and informal organizations, and also try to look at what the positives and the negatives of social capital has on resilience. So my research basically focuses on one of the few emerging areas that is coming up that links social capital and social networks to disaster resilience. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that I've just presented something small about how I'm applying social capital and resilience theories to my study. And the review of the literature will show you that there are a lot of theories, sub-theories that are coming out of the resilience literature that has been used in addressing the problems that urban planners face. And this resilience thinking is actually very relevant in our days, because when we look at the uncertainty that has to do with the imminent changes that we are we are expecting from climate change and other issues, and even if we already know that these things are going to happen, the timing of them happening also makes the resilience theory and thinking very relevant for urban planning studies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eric. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. They've just been fantastic. So I'm hoping you might have some questions out of all that for our speakers.
Or observations, I suppose.
Observations. Yeah, what could you take out of that? What was the consistency between the 4 talks? Anyone going to help me out? So what was the sense? So when we're looking at the 4 different talks, I've brought down a few different or quotes in the sense of how, when we're thinking about theory. So first of all, I think that Rebecca spoke about theory in a variety of different ways, but also theory helps you, first of all, to carefully construct an argument as well. So we saw that through all the talks, in the sense theory can help you to construct an argument. But what else was theory doing within those presentations as well?
I appreciated how James said that it's important to use theory to frame the question.
Absolutely.
Rather
Yeah.
than answer.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So you can see how important theory is to frame the question, but then to help to evaluate the problem as well. So I think that between those 4 different talks, we can see that how important theory is. Just going back to Rebecca's title of her presentation, turns out theory, doesn't make you stops you from actually going insane. You can see how critical theory actually is when you're looking at different problems, and how it actually can help you to unpack and understand the problem as well. So does anyone have any specific questions to any of the 4 presenters around their research, or how they came to their ideas, or?
I wouldn't mind asking all the presenters. Thank you very much for your presentations. Every policy and planning cycle has a measure of monitoring and evaluation at the end of it before it rolls into another cycle. And in terms of actualising your results and engaging with the practitioners, the challenge is getting them to read it in the first place. A couple of years ago, there was an article in Conversation whose title was something like "Planning Theory or Research." Not a lot of people read it.
That was Elizabeth Taylor and Joe Hurley's.
Correct. Yeah, Joe Hurley. Yeah.
Excellent.
Really good article, and obviously one of the points made was that your plan is a time portal. How have you gone about not only actualising your results and your research, but engaging with practitioners in terms of gathering their feedback for monitoring and evaluation to ensure that your policy planning and planning becomes better and better every time?
That's great question. Would you like to go first? Yeah, great, thanks, Rebecca.
It's a great question. First of all, I would probably dispute that monitoring and evaluation actually occurs in policy cycles. It should, it sounds nice, but it doesn't necessarily. But to answer your actual question, because you brought up Liz, like that gives me a reason to talk about something that she and Helen Rowe did together, which was create a workshop space for a day for all kinds of practitioners and consultants to come together and talk about car parking policy. I saw that as a really, really great way of bringing a whole bunch of theory, research, academia and experience together in a kind of a space where people could mush all of these things together and kind of talk it out, realise that and one of the things that actually really strongly came out of that is practitioners walked out with these, big eyes going, oh my God, I thought it was just me. Like I thought like parking was the bane of my existence, but it turns out everyone has these problems. It was a really transformational day, and I think that things like that are better examples than I suppose the traditional idea that you're talking about of just putting out papers and expecting that somehow they're magically going to be going to journals and reading them in all of their free time that they have. So, I think that these things are happening, and it's about finding these spaces where, practitioners and academics are able to just more readily transfer knowledge and hash things out together.
Yeah, that's great.
Just add quickly to that too. I guess beyond the sort of publishing your work and going into the sort of standard conventional forums to disseminate the knowledge that it generates, I think one of the practices or praxis that is quite inspiring. You see different members of faculty take it up in this school is engaging with community groups through their work and using their knowledge to give them information. And to go back to the frenetic, planning research, knowledge is not power, power is knowledge, and so you need to inform the community so they can see what's actually happening around them, so they can get a sense for what policies might be changing to give them, I guess, ammunition to use in their discussions and debates with governments and different groups as well. And you see that happening a lot. So that's another way, I think, of getting the knowledge out there that's outside of conventional channels that's quite effective.
I would also say, I've at least, I guess it's maybe more an opportunity for a master's or a PhD student, but my PhD research, I spent the last 2 years embedded in a local council, and for a period of about 6 months across that time I've worked out of their offices full-time. And that has allowed me to have just daily conversations with them about the research that I've been doing, about the literature, about the theory, to observe their practice and the realities of their practice, and then for us to have really productive conversations. And I've helped with their evaluations too, as almost in like an exchange for access. And so there are kind of creative ways in which academics can kind of insert themselves in, or because of that, totally, there's no time to read theory. So that's one way of making it really informal.
I think this is an issue that has really been discussed, especially in the resilience literature, for instance. There is this resilience actually is being developed in the people in the ecological sciences, and there's this alliance that is called Resilience Alliance that is based in, I think, Sweden, that has a team of theorists and researchers, and they are rather collaborative with people in the metropolitan areas, for instance. I mean, people in the policy making areas. There was this article that I read by Kitty Wilkinson, which she did a research based on, the urban planners' understanding of what resilience theories are, and then how they are really applying these theories into the urban plans that they are making. Yeah, so it's something that is really important.
I think we are getting better at finding spaces to share knowledge, but it's always a challenge. But I think we are progressing. So do we have time for one more question, or ready to go?
Yeah,
okay, we've got one more question, and then yeah.
This is specifically the area your research with resilience. You mentioned that obviously that informal settlements are hardest hit, and other, you know, the hardest hit by disasters. In your case, flooding. Do you think there's space, or should there be space, or is there space for talk in the resilience sphere about the underlying causes of those informal settlements? Should those underlying causes of informal settlements be more thoroughly addressed in terms of resilience, in terms of city resilience?
So that brings to how urban, policymakers has addressed the problems of resilience over the years, and the understanding has been that the informal settlements actually are problems, and for that matter, the approaches as let's clear them off. And this is something that we have done over the years, and it's not working. Other people are saying that why not grow the economy, especially in the formal sector, and automatically we're going to have the informal sector coming on board and the rest. But if we have tried this for the past 5 decades or so, and we are not seeing any improvement. And with Millennium Development Goals, for instance, most governments implementing policies that tries to improve the living conditions in these areas. Yes, we are seeing some marginal decline in terms of proportion, but with urbanization, we are seeing that these people, in terms of absolute numbers, are rather increasing. So my approach, or my thinking is consistent with others, which indicates that why not rethink the way we do things, and not necessarily see these informal settlements as problems. Because when you go to African countries, for instance, it's serving to the tune of, providing housing to almost half of the populations in most urban areas in informal, in Africa. So that's how come I am trying to contribute to the idea of rethinking how these informal settlements are managed, and not necessarily to see them as a problem. Because we've done this over the years, and we are not seeing any much more changes.
That's a brilliant answer. In the sense, and that very much points to our later part of our lecture series, in the sense around, I suppose, new frames within contemporary urban planning, and resilience is absolutely at the forefront. So I just want to thank, if we can all thank our speakers once again.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. Look, so the second part of the lecture session is me giving a plain old lecture. I'm going to try and keep it, I always say this, I'm going to try and keep it short-ish. It's possibly, I don't know whether it's going to make it easier or harder that I suddenly come down with some kind of stupid respiratory illness. So, I went for a walk on Saturday night, and it was kind of unexpectedly cold, and then yesterday I was in this community garden that I'm associated with, selling raffle tickets in the wind, and on the third day, the old man took sick and keeled over. So
Don't breathe into the microphone.
oh, why not? So I want to zip through this early planning innovation and advocates, and I think it's valuable partly just because it's the basis of where contemporary planning, it's the foundations of contemporary planning as we understand it, and some of the same ideas just carry through and carry through and carry through, and also so it's important, I think, for you all to know, the giants that you're standing on the shoulders of, but also I'm going to bring up a few little bits and pieces that will be elaborated on later down the track, particularly in next week's lecture. So you'll remember last week I was talking about Margot Huxley and her 3 types of planning history, and I barely covered utopian histories, I just mentioned that, the regulatory history idea, and then the histories of diffusion, which is what I want to talk about now to a certain degree. So Huxley says that this type of planning history examines the diffusion of planning ideals and ideas, usually postulating origins in Europe, the UK or the US. I'm pretty sure the UK is is part of Europe, but whatever, we'll let Huxley have that. And tracing the means by which planning concepts circulated between countries and were instantiated in colonial settlements. So colonial settlements is something that is going to come up next week in particular, and I think we'll have some quite a bit to look at as the kind of the rise of planning as a discipline and the rise of 20th century colonialism. Of course, colonialism has a longer history than just the 20th century, but planning certainly has a huge impact. And in a way, planning goes on the back of colonialism in the 20th century in the way that cities develop particularly, let's say about 100 years ago. She also points out, Huxley does, that there's a common assumption that the more that something is diffused, so the more that ideas spread out, the weaker they become, the further they get from the centre, which is, I think, a really interesting idea, not just in planning, but in all kinds of notions of the spread of, knowledge or innovation or whatever. I don't know whether it's... I suspect it's probably not true, but I'm open to discussion. So Camillo Sitt, I'm really going to... There is a bit of a rapid fire here of particular, long dead people who had quite remarkable ideas in their time, and many of these ideas are now second nature to us. We don't think about them too much, but it probably took someone to have them in the first place. They're not just, in the ether. Camillo Sitt is an Austrian architect and artist, and he produces a book in German in very late in his life. So he died quite early. I think he was about 60 when he died. And he produces a book about, I think it's called Der Städtebau, or is that the journal that he produced? In either case, he's looking about the application of artistic principles to city streetscapes and city planning. So he's making a case for against rigid grid planning, as per this image that he reproduces of the Place Maron in Lyon. Please excuse my French accent. And he makes a big case for the advantages of a scenic and attractive streetscape that draws you in as a person walking through the city, walking through a beautiful old city. He's saying we don't want to pull everything down and start again. Yes, the cities are problematic, but we don't want to pull everything down and start again. We want to celebrate some things that have come together organically. Sure, what does that have to do with planning per se? Well, I guess you can imagine that, apart from anything else, when planners come along and say, the city's a mess, we're just going to have to completely delete it and restart, then others will say, no, it's less of a mess than you think. It's actually, part of one of the wonderful things about living in this particular city is the beauty of it and the messiness of it in a way. I'd say that that's something that Sitt promotes to a certain degree. Sitt has a lot to say. Sitt has a lot to say about the way that you approach particular buildings from particular angles, and this has a huge impact on particular, urban design and urban planning over the 20th century. And Sitt also creates some plans of his own, and this is one of his plans, not really realised, but he's trying to replicate not just this sort of, I really don't like this word, but I'm going to use it, and we all know what it means, organic design. So it looks like it came about over hundreds of years, even if it came about over a couple of years. He tries to replicate that, and he's also thinking about, and this is something that has a big impact on planners in the 20th century, the notion of the village, be it an urban village, the notion of a community, whether it's an urban community or an actual village community, and this notion really takes hold in the 20th century. Now, which comes first? I think there is often, let's call it a racially based notion of the wonderful common folk and how they live together in harmony in small units, and how can we make this happen in a bigger sort of urban landscape. That's often discussed. There's also some practical aspects to it, and that, I guess, translates into the neighbourhood unit and so on later down the track. Now, these two individuals. I'm going to talk about more next week when I talk about colonial planning. They did their major work. Two architect planners, Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry, they were British. They studied, I believe, at the University of Liverpool in the 1930s. They practiced in the 40s and 50s, and they were, I think they are possibly, you can disagree with me, but I think they're possibly an example of people whose intentions were benign. They were, however, active in British possessions in Africa in the last, 10 or 20 years of British Empire building or maintenance in Africa, and they were trying to impose a whole set of their own ideas and ideals about how people should live onto the subject peoples of particular British African possessions. So here they are attempting on the right to rationalise, and I believe this is quite hypothetical, but they're trying to rationalise a particular village into something that is much more streamlined and zoned, and all of these notions of imposition. I guess I was particularly interested in that image because of the superficial similarity it has to Howard's Garden City, what do you call it, scheme. Not a plan so much as a scheme, and I'll get onto that again later when I talk about Canberra too. I feel like planning in the interests of capital, which is something else that Huxley talks about, and something which is a constant question for argument and discussion, and always interesting. I might pick that up in a week or two. I just think it is always useful to think about the world as so many planners and planning theorists have done in this kind of Marxist form, where the economy is the bottom part of, let's say, a triangle, or the essential part, the intrinsic part of society, and the culture is sitting on top of that. Here's another good, better explanation. Only it's not a triangle; it's a circle. But you can see the same kinds of ideas there, where social institutions and so on are dependent to a greater or lesser degree on the base in any given society, or let's say in a capitalist society. But as with everything here, I don't really have the time to go into these in great detail. I do like this sort of joke image where, whichever way you look at it, the workers are, rooted. But as I say, do we have time? Here's another related idea where planning aids the white able-bodied patriarchy, and I think that's something that you should always be thinking about all the time, whatever you do, where planning projects and planning ideas, what underpins them in terms of the assumptions and what their actual ultimate goals are. Great image here from I think it's Baltimore, it's Washington DC poster of the 1960s, and I'll be talking more in coming weeks about particularly in a Melbourne context, the discussion, the argument, the controversy that surrounded and still surrounds who is planning being done for when it comes to, for instance, freeway planning. And that was a big question that came up with the East-West Link a few years ago, and it's also a big question that's coming up with the present Western Tunnel debate as well. Who is actually reaping the benefit of these major infrastructure projects, and who is being disadvantaged. Here's a great example from Melbourne, and you will see this is the early 70s, when there were major feeder roads being planned to run through Parkville and Carlton towards the F19 and the F12 freeways, and you can see that this would mean, I think, we'd probably, if this had gone ahead, we'd be hearing traffic noise right now from where we are, around here somewhere, and we'd be equidistant from these two major roads, for what that's worth. So there are appeals within this kind of thing to heritage concerns and values. There are questions, okay, so who are these freeways actually for? Is it about the efficient running of the city, or is it about certain people within the city getting an advantage over others? And certainly there was a strong feeling 40-something years ago that the poor were being disadvantaged because the poor tended to live in the inner city at that time, and the rich, particularly people out in the eastern suburbs, were going to get a fast track into the CBD, and bankers, in the stereotypes of the time, bankers would be able to drive into their Melbourne offices over the foundations of homes that had once housed decent, honest working people. One individual who I'm sure you've become familiar with, and once again talking about more in coming weeks, is, and I guess this is, if we're going to talk about foundation people, this is someone you really need to be thinking about and know about. Robert Moses is a great kind of, whatever he may or may not have been as an individual, he's a great catch-all and a great symbol of rampant freeway development. He operated in New York for a lot of the 20th century, and he stayed the same, I think we could say, but the world changed around him, so that by the end of his career he was absolutely demonised as an individual who rode roughshod through the city of New York, destroyed many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives with his road building campaigns, and his kind of single-minded adherence to the notion of freedom in the automobile. Freedom in the automobile. I'll talk more about him, but I think there is also a strong race element to the way that people talk about Moses as well, and that is particularly interesting. I really don't have time to talk about Salt City, North Carolina, or for that matter, places like Laverton in Western Australia, or even the Pembleway project at Redfern. These are things that will come up in a few weeks from now. We'll have a special guest speaker to talk about this stuff. But what I think is important to bear in mind is that for a lot of the 20th century, and it's still true, let's face it, in large part today, it's not that the planners are in control so much, but there is certainly a belief in the value of knowledge as practiced by, if not faceless like these guys, but by white male experts. And I think this is something that we're hoping ultimately might crumble and fade, but it's still an ongoing problem in most aspects of society, let's face it. So I do love this image, which came out of oddly enough, an article in a magazine produced by the Commonwealth Bank, I think, in the 1940s. But it's, I do adore these guys in their suits and waistcoats. One of them prodding at a little part of a model, and they're the future as far as this particular artist or way of thinking is concerned. This particular trope. This is where the planners are now in control, and the planners are going to move forward. I'll be talking more about this next week when I talk about modernism. So this list often sends students into paroxysm of upset because it's a big long list of birth and death dates, and you do sort of go, God, do I need to know who all these people are? No, you don't. It's just that they are, I'm going to run through a few of them. I've already talked about Camillo Sitt. I'm going to talk briefly about Ebenezer Howard, who is just someone that, sadly, or happily, you need to know about. You need to know what, where he was coming from, and so on. Many of these people as we go down the list. So I love this image of Howard as well, apparently sleeping standing up while some unknown is orating. Howard is, by this stage obviously, a very old man. He did live quite a long life. And unlike almost everybody in history, and I'm going to say almost everybody in this room, he had a big idea and he saw it come to fruition, like in his lifetime. Not only that, and I guess I can take heart from this, he had a big idea, in middle age, so maybe my big idea is about to hit me and I'm going to see it come to fruition in my lifetime. But he certainly, he had a long and full life, and then he hit on this notion that maybe there was a way to improve city life for city dwellers and the nation as a whole. So Howard, there's a few things that you need to know about Howard that make him more explicable. He was clearly not a planner because there was no such thing as planners when for most of the time that Howard was alive. I suppose he could have said right at the end of his life, now I know what an urban planner is. He might not have known it by that name, but he in one sense he gave rise to a profession. In one sense, he was employed for most of his life as a stenographer, which is more or less, it's not really a profession anymore. There's still people who produce court transcripts, but they do it from tape recordings. I know because my brother is one. Howard, there's a, you don't need to know, but there's something called Pitman shorthand that you could basically make notes, make an accurate transcription of what someone's saying as they say it. And this was Howard's specialty for most of his life. There was a little break that he took in the 1870s when I guess he was in his early 20s. He went to the USA and he attempted to become a farmer, which Peter Hall, who's written extensively about Howard, says was disastrous. He was completely unable to be a farmer. I mean, he was an urban dweller. He was born and grew up in the centre of London, and there's no particular reason to imagine that he could be a success at farming. He then went to Chicago for a time, and that's where he took on this. He got this stenographer, his first stenographer jobs, and Chicago. This is an aside, but Chicago was known in the 1870s and 80s as the Garden City. It's presumably where Howard got the phrase from, but whether it really was a Garden City is another question. Howard, nevertheless, he had travelled a little bit. He was a utopian. He wanted reform. He hated the city. He thought London was, accursed. He thought London was an abomination, and he had very good reason for thinking that, and he was probably correct. So he wanted to see a way to change London. He was keen to see technology applied, and he was keen to see progressive people coming together to make something better. What kind of templates did he look for around the world? He might have looked to Chicago, which, when it was replanned after the Great Fire, had a lot of parkland and things like that. But Chicago was probably, from Howard's point of view, already bad as well. Like it was a huge city. It had grown, same age as Melbourne. It had grown, 40 years or so. It had grown to be a total megalopolis. So he probably wouldn't have been too much in favour of Chicago. Oddly enough, he looked to Adelaide, which we probably would feel a bit weird about now, the city of Adelaide in South Australia. And there's a general belief that Howard was familiar with the central plan for Adelaide, which puts the city in parkland. He didn't realise, as you can see from this map here, that there was a whole lot of suburbs beyond that he just thought that was the city, and he was into that. And I don't think he certainly didn't visit Australia or anything like that, so he wouldn't have seen it. In any case, he produced a couple of books, a sort of a false start called Tomorrow, which came out in, I think, 1898, and then this Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which was kind of, where he felt he got everything right in this instance. and a whole lot of images and ideas that come out of this book that have a massive impact on the world. Still have that impact on the world today. And this is, once again, I think we need to have this explained to us. It took me a bit of figuring out. That little blue square there, that little blue block with the people written on it, I believe is a magnet or a magnetised piece of metal. And those three things around the outside are, of course, magnets. So the people are being attracted in some way by these three magnets. And from Howard's point of view, I think it is absolutely plain that since Town Country, down at the bottom, combines all the positives of town and country without any of the negatives, the people will be attracted to this idea of town country. As Hall says, the ingredients were far from original. What Howard could claim was that his was a unique combination of proposals. And there were industrialists who were very keen to see this come into play because they could see that there was an advantage to building a factory, hypothetically in the countryside, and getting the people to move nearby and be workers in the factory. This was a time when industrialists were very keen on the notion of, for want of a better term, a captive workforce, so it worked for them. Here is something that was a core part of Howard's ideas, but which never really made it into the canon as far as the way that Howard's ideas were adopted wholesale. And as Hall says, people failed ultimately to understand that one of the things that Howard wanted to do was get rid of landlords. People would still pay rent, but the rent would be small and it would be for the upkeep of the city. It wouldn't be for, to line anyone in particular's pockets. Those kinds of things. It is quite a socialist notion in lots of ways. Common ownership, all of that kind of stuff. Common decision making, which tended to get lost in the adoption. And what people did embrace fairly preposterously is this scheme, which is intended to show how the new cities of the Garden City movement, Garden City ideal, would relate to each other and communicate with each other. Was not intended to be a map or a plan. If it was a plan, it was a conceptual plan, not a plan of concentrically arranged cities with in a big set of circles, bicycle spokes or pizza slice, whatever you want to call it. Here you can see he's put population figures on the particular cities, and he's given some of them names, just sort of unimaginative names. Rurisville, which I guess just means country city or something, that kind of stuff. And he also created this kind of thing, which once again, he was always very keen to say, look, I'm not a planner. There was no such thing as a planner, but he was saying, look, I'm not saying this is how we should lay out the streets. It's just how things should be related to each other. But I think it's pretty clear that once you start putting pretty pictures in front of people, they just go, yeah, I want that. So we even have, you can see in this 21st century reimagining of Garden City ideas, it also has that same kind of feel about it, doesn't it? It's not quite circular, but it does have a whole lot of diagonals meeting in the centre, and then it's one of a set of components joined to each other, and so on. Okay, so put Howard to one side. I'll just say that Howard, you couldn't have been happier than Howard at the end of his life. He's living in a garden city. Like, he's actually living in Welland Garden City, which is the second garden city to exist. and he can say, well, in 30 years, I've not only had an idea, but thousands of people have rallied together to make it happen, and here I am living in a garden city. The future is no doubt bright, and the world will thank me ever more. Another key player in the garden city story is this guy Raymond Unwin, who was another socialist, essentially. He's an architect and a planner. He forms a partnership with his brother-in-law, Barry Parker, and they start designing, for various philanthropists, they start designing village-type arrangements where people live. Once again, that kind of sit idea of embracing the notion of how the folk live, how the common folk live, and particularly, I suppose, in this case, the way that the poor British people should or would want to live. So New Earswick is one of their early ones. They then win a competition to design Letchworth, and Letchworth is the first garden city, and Letchworth is, as you can see, absolutely nothing, looks nothing like a bicycle wheel or a pizza. It's a very, very different proposition, and it's the first garden city 5 years after Howard published his first book on the topic. Unwin was very influenced by Sitt, aesthetically, visually, but Sitt only wrote in German. Someone translated Sitt into French. Unwin read Sitt in French, and it appears that the French version was a really terrible translation, so he didn't really get much out of it except for pictures. But he was, nevertheless, his interpretation of what Sitt was talking about was, in many ways, extremely influential on him, if that makes sense. So that's not diffusion of ideas so much as it's distortion in a sense, but it seemed to work for him. I would love to dwell longer on this cartoon, but time is a-wasting, and I can see I'm going to have to cobble together a lot of this lecture into next week's, but that's okay. We'll just get through a lot then. Maybe you can take cold pills with pseudoephedrine like I have, and it'll make everything seem much more doable and bearable. So Welland, Louis de Soissons created this, and this is where Howard lived in the last 10 years of his life. Letchworth with that village ideal. Now this is where things, this is probably, after this is probably a good place to wind it up, and I'll repackage everything beyond this into next week's lecture. But this is where things get problematic and difficult and scary. So Henrietta Barnett is, I've got young Henrietta Barnett and old Henrietta Barnett there. They're both the same person. And she was I don't actually know much about her, except that she was married to Samuel Barnett, who was a minister of religion in London. They were both part of the Octavia Hill's group, Octavia Hill being a social reformer and social campaigner in London in the 19th century. They felt the need to help the poor in the slums. They were horrified by what they saw in the slums, and the slums were definitely horrible. They were Oxford graduates. They had a lot of contact with slum dwellers and a lot of interest in their fate. And there were a few things in play here. The Barnetts lived in Hampstead, which was at this point just outside London. And when Henrietta Barnett heard that there were plans to build a railway line that would go through Hampstead and open it up for suburbanisation, she said, well, this is horrible, but she saw not only a problem but also an opportunity and a way to solve a few things at once. So she was quite a visionary in that regard. She got Unwin to design a garden suburb which would retain a lot of open space. So a lot of what people valued about Hampstead was this heath area, and this garden suburb would retain a huge amount of open space. There was also a lot of open space, a lot of greenery within the suburb itself, and so in that sense it was a conservation tactic, and it was also creating a beautiful suburb rather than just a crappy old, ordinary, subdivided and sell it off suburb. It had a sense of unity and purpose to it, and part of the purpose was that the poor people would be allowed to live there alongside rich people. There's a strong feeling in the late 19th, early 20th century that all poor people needed really was a bit of exposure to culture, and Patrick Geddes, who I'll talk about more next week, would do things like he and his wife lived in the slums of Edinburgh, and part of their being there was providing moral uplift and also, advice, general advice, to the very poor in Edinburgh. So there's this sense that the rich had a duty, the rich and cultured. I suppose that being rich wasn't necessarily the prime thing. The middle class and the rich and the cultured people had a duty to help the poor up. And some of the elements of Hampstead Garden Suburb were, for instance, these delightful buildings that are have a kind of a medieval, like an old school kind of style to them, which was partly Unwin's survey of Sitt. He saw this kind of thing in Sitt's work, and he wanted to replicate it. And so, what might surprise you is this is a garden suburb. Okay, Howard is out there talking about the garden city. He's talking up this notion of the garden city. The garden city is a concept where new cities are built, old cities decline. When the garden city is created, and the people go to the place that's the best of the city in the country, they're going to leave places like London in droves. They're going to leave the old industrial cities far behind. They're not going to, if they've got the choice, they're not going to want to stay in big, dense, dirty, smelly, unhealthy city areas. They're going to want to go to garden cities. What Barnett does and Unwin does, and Unwin and Parker in designing Hampstead Garden Suburb were seen as turncoats. They were seen as deserting the garden city movement and in fact, thwarting it to some degree, because they created something that was going to make London more bearable to live in. They were actually ameliorating the problems of the metropolis. They weren't going out and killing London, they were curing London. So this was a major problem for many, particularly the more utopian of that early 20th century time. Hilariously, Hampstead Garden Suburb was created with this notion of having lots of places for poor people to live. So it was social mix. It really was a socially mixed area in its first few decades. The rulings weren't kept in place, and eventually it became pricier and pricier. It is now one of the most expensive places in London to live. So its beauty, in one sense, killed off even that concept that Barnett and probably Unwin as well had for it. What they've created is a incredibly upmarket and really sumptuous, like delightful to walk around. If you go to London, you should definitely go to Hampstead Garden Suburb and have a look, because it's beautiful and it has all kinds of elements to it that really have survived, and there's many people who live there who are very committed to maintaining that aesthetic. Nevertheless, it's not what it was initially. It was never a garden city, by the way. It was a garden suburb. Garden suburb is a bit of a wishy-washy term, and its success was its demise, if that makes sense. I'm going to finish now. Hopefully next week I will be feeling a lot better, and That's what I think anyway. Hopefully, I'll be feeling better, and we can pick up then and go on. So, thank you very much, and thank you again to our amazing speakers who were great earlier. The readers will be available tomorrow. We got word. The readers will be available in the shop, the co-op shop tomorrow.